All right, everyone. Well, 2018, as far as Sunday services are concerned, 2018 is coming to a close. And the last Sunday of every year, we take a little bit of time to not only reflect upon what peace is, but to reflect a little bit, to review a little bit. How well have we done in the previous year with living the peace that we know is there? Where do we want to be on the last Sunday of 2019 with regards to peace? What is this thing called peace? Where is this thing called peace? What can we do, if anything, to expand our experience of peace? So tomorrow, I just want to mention before we get started, tomorrow morning on the East Coast, 7 a.m. on the East Coast, noon Greenwich time. So if you calculate wherever you are from either Greenwich time or East Coast time, you can figure it out. But at 7 a.m., which is noon Greenwich time, on the last day of the year, this is when John Randolph Price had started the World Healing Meditation, or the World Peace Meditation. It's called by both names. And when we were down at Wilmington, we used to go down to the boardwalk down on Carolina Beach, and we would meet there by 7 o'clock in the morning. And we would join millions of people all over the world who were just taking a moment in whatever their tradition might be. It's a non-denominational thing. To pray, to meditate, to visualize, to read, to sing, to do whatever it was that their heart was telling them to do to express peace. And it's kind of a mystical experience, or it can be kind of a mystical experience to be in that place and sense this energy of peace, this rising of consciousness, rising of peace and consciousness. And Lori and I started doing this back in the 80s. We were living out in Colorado at the time, so we had to get up, I guess it was like 5 o'clock in the morning there. We had to get up at that time to, excuse me, to do this. And one morning when I was sitting there and doing this, and just kind of this, Lori would say, it feels like you're riding the wave. You're just kind of caught up in this wave, this consciousness, this feeling. And while we were participating in that, I had a visualization. I could see in my mind's eye, if you will, the Berlin Wall come down. Not just tumble down, but it was like chunks were being knocked out of it, and people were walking through from one side to the other, and the people from both sides were shaking hands. And that's what I saw in my mind's eye. And of course, a couple years after that, it came to pass pretty much in that way. And I wondered, well, did I get a sneak preview? Was this a premonition, or was the Berlin Wall just kind of like the symbol of the lack of peace in my mind, and the experience of peace involved that disillusion? I don't know. I don't know one way or the other. But I do know that I saw that during this meditation, and it happened a couple years later. It was a pretty powerful experience for me. So I invite you, wherever you are tomorrow, if you can, at noon Greenwich time, just take a few minutes to stop and to pray and treat and meditate, visualize, do whatever you feel comfortable doing for the purpose of the experience of peace. First within yourself. It has to start within yourself. It's like putting the oxygen mask on in the airplane. You have to put it on yourself before you can be of any help to others. Peace within, and then peace without. So let's talk about this idea of peace then. Let's talk about what is peace? What kind of peace are we talking about today? Peace seems to be a theme. If you go to in any religion, it seems to be a theme. You know, they all talk about peace. They all talk about love. Our politicians talk about peace. You know, what they want is they want peace, and they'll tell us that everything that they're doing, you know, that they want to do is to ensure peace. And then when they send our young people off to war, well, they'll tell us, well, they didn't have any choice. They didn't have any choice but to do that. And of course, if you look at history and you look back, there was usually another choice. They just didn't take it. What is it about human consciousness that accepts war? What is it about human consciousness that accepts the sentiments of hate and of anger and of fear that lead up to war? Why do we as human beings allow that to continue to exist in our consciousness? And the point I'm trying to make here is that what goes on in the world, in world affairs, what goes on in our personal affairs is a reflection of consciousness. Pretty much people do the things that make sense to them by right of consciousness. Perhaps we should say by right of unconsciousness, because there's very little conscious thought involved in many things that people do. They get an idea and they act upon it. I was sharing with our Wednesday night group. I'm waiting for a book to come, but I read a brief article about it in Scientific American. The author's name is Peter Carruthers, and he wrote a book about working memory, and he puts forward the premise that there's no such thing as a conscious thought. That we as human beings, we have the illusion that we are having conscious thoughts, that we are controlling the thinking process. But what he's saying is that thoughts arise someplace else, in a different part of awareness other than what he calls working memory. And we become aware of them. This is exactly what we learn in meditation. Where do thoughts come from? Where do thoughts go? For whom does the thought arrive? All these different techniques of meditation that we practice over the years have taught us by experience, you know, what he's coming to speculate on intellectually. But he adds to it that when the thought arises, we believe it to be real. We believe it is us thinking the thought, and it's true by virtue of the fact that we thought it. And if there are any missing details, our imagination sort of fills them in, right? So we're storytellers. We're basically storytellers, and it's you can see that you can just see something happen on the news or something happen in, you know, the public where you live, and everybody's got a different version of the story, why it happened, what happened, and all these things. Imagination is kind of filling in the things that weren't necessarily there. We're making stuff up, but the stuff that we're making up makes sense to us. So these ideas, this place that Carruthers calls working memory, this place that where all of these different opinions and these ideas and these facts that we make up and these things that we believe to be true, all of that is the realm that I would call understanding. Understanding, just for the purpose of today's talk. We're calling that the realm of understanding, because today we want to talk about the peace that passes understanding. The peace that passes understanding. So in the New Testament, we're told that there's a peace that passes all aspects of understanding. And to me, what that means is it breaks through that chatter of the monkey mind. You know, we were talking over the last month or so about the Buddhist concept of the monkey that becomes conscious or wakes up, and it's in a locked house. and it has 5 windows corresponding to the 5 senses, and it runs around back and forth, and it looks through each of the senses, it looks through each of these windows, and it's trying to formulate some idea, something that makes sense about what's going on here. And the idea there is that we kind of do the same thing. We become aware that we are aware. We become aware of this thing, I am, this ego, this consciousness. And we were trying to make sense. We were trying to grasp onto little bits and pieces of information and make sense out of the whole thing. And all of that is the activity of the intellect. All of that is the chatter of the monkey mind. All of that is the ripples on the pond that the example of meditation teaches us, There's a precious jewel in the pond, and we're trying to see it, but we can't because the surface is so agitated. And if we wish to be able to experience that precious jewel, we have to stop the agitation. We have to shut it down. So within that level that I would say is human understanding or human intellectual activity, and the ego being the creation of the intellect. Excuse me. So the intellect is constantly weighing and analyzing and judging and forming opinions, and this is good and that's not good, and this one is good and that one's not good, and this one's mean and that one's dangerous, and all of these other things that the intellect is doing. It forms an idea about who you and I are, an opinion. I am this, I am that. I am not this, I am not that. It forms opinions about the way things ought to be, the way things should be. And all of that kind of goes into the ego. So the intellect is constantly trying to weigh and analyze and judge and decide. And the ego is prepared to struggle and to fight in order to protect the ideas that it holds about the way things ought to be, the way things ought to be. And I ask you to go back and look at the conflict in the world today, the conflict in the world throughout history, the conflict in your own life today, and consider whether or not all of that comes from nothing more than an idea about the way things ought to be. So we form these ideas. We have this expectation almost in consciousness. We form these ideas that, we have to be prepared to struggle. We have to be prepared to go to war if we want to be able to experience peace. We're always poised. We're always on that footing, if you will, of ready to use force. We believe in the necessity of that. And because we believe in the necessity of that, it is a necessity. And of course, what happens in world conflict is enemies mutually arise. One of our friends from down at the coast here, Bob Anspach, was sharing with me that he had gone to Japan. He was visiting Japan, and he went to I don't know whether you would call it a museum or a memorial, and it was in Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It was one of the 2 cities where the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese people. And he went there, and it was a tourist place. There was foreign tourists, there were Japanese tourists there. A lot of people came to it, and he said he was kind of overcome with emotion when he stopped to realize what had happened there, And a Japanese man came up to him and said, he said, don't feel too bad. We did horrible things during that war too. So here was a man who was trying to help Bob with his grief, with his emotions, with his feelings. And we have to understand that that comes from the Buddhist concept that enemies mutually arise. Enemies mutually arise. If one side starts building up arms because they don't trust the other side says, well, we need to build up arms because we don't trust them. And, you know, it's like the two toughest kids on the block. Eventually, they're going to come to blows. And we have to ask ourselves, what would the experience of the human race be if these ideas of the necessity, these ideas of the necessity of hostilities and the necessity of war, what would the history of the world be? What would my personal experience of the world be if those ideas weren't there? If those ideas, as Emma Curtis Hopkins would say, if we could tame the mind, if we could tame the mind. So the first idea that I want to discuss today is, what is true peace? Right? So Spinoza, the mystic, of course, Spinoza gives us a definition that I think passes understanding. He says, peace is not the absence of war. It is not the intermittent period in between hostilities. Not the cessation of hostilities. But it's a way of being. It is a way of living. Now we don't understand that intellectually. We don't understand that from our ego. We don't kind of get that. You know, we think peace is when two sides sit down and they sign a peace treaty, you know. The cessation of hostilities. We think peace is the time in between wars. We're not really fighting. We have peacetime armies, we have peacetime navies. But when we're at peace, even then, our forces are training for war. So are we really at peace? Or are we just in a lull? You know, it's like the energy comes up to a crescendo and it explodes into violence, and the violence gets tremendous. And then there's an exhaustion that takes place. Stop. No more of this. But in 15 or 20 or 30 years, the energy starts to build back up again, and things arise again. Look at the interval. We're just going through the 100th anniversary of the armistice of the end of the First World War, and less than 20 years later, all of the same actors were back involved again. It was like they just came up and clashed and got tired, signed a peace treaty, regrouped, rebuilt, and had at it again. So this is the human history. This is the history of the world based on understanding, based on the intellect, based on the ego. And what is important, I think, to keep in mind is that with all of the people involved, with all of the players involved, what was going on made sense. So it's not going to be until these things don't make sense that we get to experience that peace. Now here's the second part of this. Right? So the peace that passes understanding is not based on external conditions. And this is the human understanding. The human understanding is that I will be at peace when something out there changes, when someone out there changes, when the other side changes. When everybody, like my dad used to say, be agreeable, do it my way. When everybody just behaves the way that I want them to behave, then I will be at peace. That is the human understanding or the human concept of peace. And of course that's not peace at all. We think if we had enough we would be peaceful, but that's not true at all. If we have enough we want more. That's the human nature, we want more. Look at the richest people in the world. Are they sitting back and saying, wow, I've got all this money. I don't have to worry about a thing. No. What if we lose it? What if the markets turn against us, or how can we get more? Those kind of things. Look at the salaries of athletes. Some of these ball players, they give them a contract for millions of dollars, and for a little while they're the highest paid player in the sport. They have more money than they can possibly ever spend. And then somebody on another team gets a couple $1 million more a year than they're getting, and then it's suddenly, oh, well, my salary is not enough. So it's this idea, you see. It is not the reality of whether they have enough. It's this idea. It's this idea, this lack of satisfaction. So we have to kind of consider, if we're not at war, are we afraid of war? Are we planning and looking and thinking about all of the things all of our other enemies might be doing? And while we're doing that, we're not at peace. We're not at peace. Now, from a practical perspective, you might say, well, we kind of need that, because the world is a dangerous place. That is from the level of understanding. That is from the level of understanding. We want to step back past that and say, from the spiritual level, do I truly believe that everything that I experience in my life is an outpicturing of my consciousness? Do I truly believe that it is done unto me according to my belief? See, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us there's no mixture of evil in our idea of good. That's what we have to remind ourselves of. There's no mixture of evil in our idea of good. And there it starts, because if you look at the idea of God, and we're going to go into this much more in January, this idea, what is your idea of God? Many of the common ideas of God are that God has enemies, see? And God wants people punished, and God okays us to go out and punish God's enemies, who just happen to be our enemies, by the way. Those people we don't like, they must be God's enemies and they need to be punished. Holy wars, can you imagine? You can just think of the oxymoron there, a holy war. Holy wars have been fought where religions all talking about peace, they go out and send their adherents to kill one another. And they can do that. They can do that because if you go back to the fundamental belief, the fundamental ideas that all sides hold, are that God has enemies and it's okay to kill God's enemies. But that's just an idea, you see. It's just something that Dr. Carruthers might say has bubbled up into our working memory. And we believe it to be true. So what we want to do is we want to stop and go right back to the source. We want to go right back to our idea of God and understand that this thing that we call God, and Joseph Campbell says the word God is a metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. Like every limitation we know in human consciousness, this idea of God, this metaphor of God, transcends that. And there can be no conflict. There can be no conflict in perfect unity. There cannot be. There cannot be. There's no mixture of evil in my idea of good. There's no darkness contained in the light. I don't know how many different ways we want to say it, but there's God and God alone. And there is only God. A house divided against itself cannot stand. These are the words attributed to Jesus in the New Testament. And I grew up in the 60s when Star Trek was new, Everybody who understands science fiction knows you can't mix matter and antimatter together. They'll explode. And the universe as we know it will be destroyed, according to the science fiction writers. But think about it. If the divine is all powerful, if that definition of the divine, if we accept that, the divine is all powerful. If it was against itself, it would destroy itself. It would cease to exist. So we must go back to the beginning and understand that there is nothing in God that is against itself. And that divine love has created each and every one of us out of itself. The good and the bad and the ugly, all of us, it has created out of itself. So the very essence, the very nature of all beings is this goodness of God. But we've got this layer of understanding. We've got this intellectual layer. We've got the monkey mind ideas. We've got all of these things that have bubbled up that we believe to be true that are not true, and we act out of them. And if we can come to accept that below all of this junk that's floating around in our consciousness, right? I mean, turn our TV on and watch the news for 10 or 15 minutes. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. One thing after another to worry about, and most of it never comes true, right? Watch the news cycle. They'll give us something to worry about for 3 or 4 days, and then it just disappears. Like it's no longer important, and then there's something else, something bigger to worry about. And they are constantly stoking the fires in this chatter of the mind of there's something to worry about, there's something to be afraid of, there's something to struggle against. And we stay caught up in that. And we can't be at peace. We can't be at peace when we are caught up in that. Personally, we cannot be at peace when we are caught up at that. And then politically, as a country, we cannot be at peace when we are caught up in that. So the peace that passes understanding, and so understanding says, no, you're crazy. You know, you can't just ignore everything that's going on in the world. You can't just forget the fact that there are other people out there who want to do us harm. That's the understanding part. The peace that passes understanding says the truth is that there's only God. Only God. And God cannot be against itself. And we want to get past those ideas of right doing and wrong doing that Rumi tells us about. We want to get past those ideas, and we want to go to that place where there's only God. That's where we want to be. That's where true peace is. Not conditional peace, not circumstantial peace, not cessation of hostilities, not the time in between wars, but true peace. True peace. What does God have to be afraid of? Nothing. Nothing. What does God have to be angry about? Nothing. What does God fear it lacks? Nothing. Nothing. It is that unity that we wish to come to experience. That is the peace that passes understanding. Then we got to say, well, where is this peace? Where is this peace? You know, I've alluded to it that most of our concept of peace is that peace is out there. Peace is out there. Our peace is dependent upon something out there. If those people would only. And we have to come to realize that our peace, your personal peace, our peace, is dependent upon us in here, internally. Breaking our identity with the ideas in human understanding, in race consciousness, as Dr. Holmes might call it, in collective unconscious that Jung might call it. In our own mind, as we might call it, not even knowing what our own mind might be, but we call it that. But these ideas that we become aware of, that we believe to be true, we have to let go of those. We have to understand that they're mostly made up stuff. We don't even know for sure that there are ideas. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Instead of having an angry thought and thinking I must act upon it, I must be angry, can we become the observer or the witness of that angry thought and say, oh look, there goes an angry thought. And free ourselves from the trap of thinking that everything that bubbles up into our working memory, everything that we become aware of, that it's ours, and we are obligated to act upon it. For we are not. So our peace of mind is not dependent upon circumstances. And two things about that. First is, without regard to the circumstances, we can maintain our peace. Even in horrible circumstances, we can maintain our sense of peace. And Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz said no one could deny him of his right to be happy. It is a state of mind. It is a state of being. It is a state of living. We have to stop saying to ourselves, I'll be happy when something out there changes. I'll be peaceful when something out there changes. And instead recognize that the peace that passes understanding is omnipresence right here where we are right now. It has created us out of itself. It is right below the ripples in the surface of our consciousness, which is the activity of the human mind, the monkey mind, the chattering mind. And it is in silencing that mind that we come to experience this peace without regard of external conditions. So peace then is not a cessation of hostilities. It is a way of living and a way of being, and a way that recognizes and experiences the unity, a way that recognizes and experiences the goodness in all people, and refuses to get caught up in the fear-mongering and the hate and the anger that that others will try to enroll us in for their own purposes, whatever those purposes might be. And you and I, we must recognize that the only one who is responsible for our experience of peace or lack thereof is us. You and I are the only thinkers in our universe. This is what Dr. Holmes tells us. Thoughts may bubble up into the screen of awareness, but then there is something that becomes aware of them. And when that something, when that part of us becomes aware of them, we can decide whether we want to act upon them or not. We can let them go. In the analytical meditation techniques, we say, oh look, here comes a thought. Oh look, there goes a thought. Where did the thought come from? Where does the thought go? For whom does the thought arise? Who is the one observing the thought? This is practice. This is practice. We have to practice the peace that we talk about. We have to practice disidentifying with the thoughts of anger and the thoughts of hate. we have to practice being still and knowing. And it's not, I'm not talking about something that you do here and there, now and then. This is your practice. This is your practice. If you really wish to experience peace, you must practice it. Can you imagine if we wanted to learn how to play a musical instrument, and every once in a while we sat down, we played the scales, you know. Every once in a while we read a little bit about musical theory. Every once in a while we studied a little bit about notation and half notes and whole notes and things like that. We wouldn't be a very accomplished musician. One of my favorite singers is, I think I've told you, is Linda Ronstadt. Just absolutely love her voice and all of the things that she did through the years, the different genres that she mastered, you know, from the timeless classics to rock and roll. And she was being interviewed one time, and somebody asked her about that. And she said two things that I thought were kind of amazing. She said the first thing is that she sang for 8 hours a day, whether she was working that day or not. In other words, if she had a performance or not, she sang for 8 hours a day. She said that was her job, singing. And she had to learn how to do everything that she wanted to do with her voice in order to be the performer that she wanted to be. And the second thing she said was that she had been singing professionally for 10 years before she could finally do everything she wanted to do with her voice. You know, now I go back and look at the early recordings of her earliest works, and I thought they were great, but she didn't. It was practice. So I'm not saying it's hard work, but it's practice. It takes a commitment, it takes a dedication, it takes a practice. So how do we do this then? How do we go about doing this? It's, you know, so it might sound nice and esoterical, and you know, peace passes understanding, and we break through the chatter of the monkey mind, and we experience this beautiful, beautiful thing called peace. But I'm here to tell you, it takes practice. It may not take work, but it takes practice. And Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us you cannot crush these other ideas. So the ego, as I say, the ego loves to fight and loves to struggle, and its tendency is, you know, you can imagine you're sitting there in meditation and this idea comes up, and you're like a skeet shoot, you know, this idea comes up and you think, oh, there's an angry idea, pull. But you can't do that. Can't do that, because that what you struggle against, you remain attached to. See, if you believe you have to struggle against it, you believe it's real. You are giving it power that it does not have. It's just a thought. It's just an idea. You don't have to fight with it. You don't have to struggle with it. But what you can do is you can deny it. She tells us denials. This is the use of denials in our spiritual practice. And that's something easy. That's something that we can do 24/7. See, so this idea comes up, and this idea says, oh, those people are bad people, and we need to struggle against them. And we could stop right there and say, that's not true. That may be an appearance, but that's not true. God is all there is. And those people are living expressions of God. And I love the t-shirt we had for the kids in Sunday school. It said, I must be good because God don't make no junk. So this is the idea then of praying for your enemies and blessing your enemies. When we pray for our enemies and when we bless our enemies, the way that I learned as a child was, you know, we kind of pray for them that somehow God will save them the same way that God saved us, and God will show them the good way the same way that God showed us the good way. So we're trying to convert them. We're trying to make them just like us. Or as I say, my dad said, be reasonable, get them to do things our way. That's not what praying for our enemies is about. Praying for our enemies is removing everything in our own consciousness that says that somehow they are less than, somehow they are separated from God. Somehow God's love is everywhere present, but not there because they were standing behind a door when God handed out love, you see. And that is the idea in our consciousness that is unpeaceful. That is unpeaceful. And this is when we have to do the work the only place we can. Do our practice the only place we can, which is within our own consciousness. So our spiritual ideal, our spiritual goal, if you want to call it that, is to move beyond the chatter of the monkey mind and to dwell in the secret place of the Most High. To be in that experience where no harm can befall us. To be in that experience where God is all there is. And the way that we get there is to deny every idea that comes up in our consciousness that is not like that. That's as simple as we can make it, right? As simple as we can make it. That's not true. That idea is not true. It's only an idea. I won't buy into the idea that that these people are evil or those people need to be punished. I will remove from my own consciousness through my spiritual practice of denial. I will remove everything that I have accepted to be true, that I believe to be true, that is simply not true. There is no separation. There is no apartness. I want to share with you something. I mentioned it a few weeks ago, but I'll share it again. I saw a documentary film, and you know I love film and I love documentary films. I saw a documentary film by a Pakistani woman who went to the hate groups. This is at the time when they were doing everything that was done in Charlottesville, Virginia, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago maybe. And she went to them. The name of the documentary is called White Right, Meeting the Enemy. Meeting the Enemy. That's the title of it. It's on Netflix if you want to watch it. And she took her camera, just her, and looked like one other camera person, maybe running camera and sound, and herself running a camera. And she went to these different hate groups, nationalist groups, and she said to them, I just want to understand. I just want to understand. And they let her in, and they got to know her. And there's even video footage of her in Charlottesville. She was walking along with one of the nationalist groups when they were being pelted with pepper spray and rocks and things from the counter protesters, and she's getting pepper spray in her face and everything, and she's just trying to record. That's all she's trying to record, so she's trying to understand. So she got to know these folks, and they got to know her. And after a while, she said to them, do you hate me? Do you hate me? Look at my skin. I'm brown. I'm a woman. I'm Muslim. I'm everything that you're out there yelling about. Do you hate me? And he said, no. No, we don't hate you. In fact, one of the guys says, I think you're a friend. I consider you a friend. I can't hate you. She then showed them a picture of herself as a little 5-year-old girl growing up in Norway, and her dad was holding her hand tightly while a group of skinheads around them was yelling at them. And you can just see the picture, and you can see the tension there. And she said to these men, she says, what would you say to those men who are frightening that little girl, who are saying mean things and hateful things and frightening that little girl? And one guy says, he says, that makes me mad. He says, I'd punch him in the nose, And of course, the message wasn't all that subtle. You guys are doing the same thing. Different place, different time. And it was interesting to me, in that the hate couldn't be personal. It had to be generic. It had to be against an idea. It had to be against some other group. And at the very end of the show, there was a gentleman who had been a participant in these groups, and he dropped out. And he told her that what he came to realize was that it was a lot easier for him to go out on the street and shout, I hate this group, or I hate that group, or I hate these people, or I hate those people, than to admit that he was afraid. He came to realize that fear was actually what was motivating him, that the fear became anger, and the anger became hatred and rage, and that's what he was acting out of. And when he came to deal with his fear, his own fear, he no longer had a need to hate others. I thought it was a beautiful message, because if we could learn to look at people who are acting out, who are outraged, who try to intimidate us, who try to frighten us, and if we can recognize that they're scared, they're acting out of fear, they're acting out of the ideas in the monkey mind that they have come to accept as true, and that's all that's going on. They're not bad people. They're expressions of the one life. And by us breaking through our own fear that they're going to hurt us, by us breaking through that to recognize each and every other person as a beautiful expression of the divine, two things happen. Not only do we find peace within ourselves, but we may find that they respond to that. They may not, but they may respond to that. As Holmes tells us, when deep calls upon deep, deep answers. So as we close out the year with this idea of peace, I invite you to spend some time with these ideas. Spend some time with them today and for the rest of the week, and then every day. Where is it that you feel a lack of peace, a lack of ease? What are the ideas that you have accepted to be true that may or may not be true? What are the ideas that you have accepted to be true that are causing that lack of ease? Can you deny them? Can you deny them? Can you recognize that they are a lie pretending to be the truth? And can you make it a spiritual practice, even if for one day? Can you make it your spiritual practice to catch these ideas when they pop up, when they try to get into your consciousness? Excuse me, when you turn on the news or the radio, you read the paper, or if you're like me, they just, stuff just pops up in your head all the time. And stop and say, no, that's not true. That can't be true. There's only one God. There's only one life. That life is perfect. That life is God. That life is my life. Right here and right now. I love everyone. I love everything. There is nothing to fear. There is only God. And so it is.